The royal transport soared with all the arrogance of those inside it. Nobles reclined in jeweled seats, voices dripping with entitlement, oblivious to the laborers working in shadows to keep everything running. Among them, the janitor swept unseen, his presence barely tolerated. He knew every smudge on the polished floor, every bolt in the wall, but to the lords and ladies he was less than nothing. The crippled princess sat apart, frail and half-forgotten, her beauty overshadowed by her infirmity. Whispers called her a burden, one who could not even stand when duty called. When the ship jolted, laughter turned to shrieks. Systems failed in an instant, alarms howling as the vessel dropped into the pull of a hostile world. Chaos broke loose. Nobles who had sworn oaths of courage trampled each other for escape pods. Titles, ranks, centuries of etiquette shredded in seconds under the weight of raw fear. The princess cried out, but her voice was drowned in the rush of silks and boots. Those who had vowed to protect her turned their faces away. A cripple, after all, was too heavy a burden when survival hung by a thread. The janitor had no claim to heroism. He had no armor, no rank, no obligation. He could have run, could have vanished like the rest. But when fire tore through the wreckage, when steel screamed and bodies lay broken, he saw her left behind, choking on smoke, pinned in ruin. Something in him refused to walk away. He threw himself into the flames, coughing blood, hands blistering as he tore apart twisted metal with bare fingers. The weight of the collapsing ship pressed down, heat blistered his skin, but he dragged her free. She clung to him in shock, unable to comprehend why the lowest among them had done what nobles would not. The ship struck the ground with the roar of a dying beast. Steel split, fire blossomed, and silence followed, broken only by the groans of the dying. Out in the wilderness, nobles staggered away in groups, blind to anything but their own skins. The janitor stood amidst the carnage, cradling the crippled princess in arms cut and bleeding. Around him lay ruin, smoke rising into the storm-dark sky. He had carried her through fire, pulled her from death, though no one had ordered it, though no one would have blamed him for leaving her behind. Now the wilderness yawned wide before them, filled with predators and shadows. Alone, burdened with the life of someone the nobles had already abandoned, the janitor felt the weight of the impossible task pressing down. He was not trained for this, not bred for survival, but there was a stubborn fire in his chest that the crash could not extinguish. Where the nobles had fled, he remained. Where they had abandoned their oaths, he had taken up a silent one. In the ashes of the wreck, with nothing but grit and scorched flesh, the outcasts began the march into the unknown, carrying the only life that still mattered. The princess woke to a world that felt alien, the sky bruised with storms and the ground crawling with dangers her life had never prepared her for. She had lived among cushions and courtiers, shielded from pain by attendants, yet now she was carried in the arms of a man who smelled of smoke and blood. At first, her pride survived where her body had failed. She spoke with cold dismissal, reminding him of his station, demanding he obey as though he were still sweeping floors. The janitor did not answer. His focus remained on the basics of survival: air, food, water, shelter. Where she saw filth and indignity, he saw tools. The wreckage gave little, but he made it yield. Then scraps became supports for a crude shelter. Burned panels turned into windbreaks. The corpses of the ship's machines provided wiring and shards of plating that could be sharpened into weapons. His hands were scarred, his clothes burned, yet every motion carried purpose. He did not complain. He did not stop. In silence, he kept them alive. The princess watched, her commands growing quieter as she realized that titles meant nothing when no one was left to enforce them. The wilderness tested them with no mercy. Predators prowled at night, eyes glowing in the dark, teeth snapping close enough to taste. Storms lashed them with wind and acid rain, tearing down what little they built. Hunger hollowed their bodies. The nobles who had run earlier left behind trails of desperation, scattered supplies, torn fabrics, even blood. Some were found dead, consumed by the land or by each other's betrayal. They had carried jewels, but not the will to survive. Each discovery hardened the truth for the princess. The nobility's wealth had bought them nothing when stripped of walls and servants. The janitor carried her when her legs failed. He fought with improvised clubs, set traps with wire, and scavenged roots that barely passed as food. She began to see that his strength was not a quirk of muscle, but the endurance of someone who had been overlooked his whole life, forced to adapt in silence. Her arrogance wavered, replaced with reluctant respect. She asked fewer questions, offered fewer commands. Instead, she listened. And in listening, she began to see him not as a servant, but as the only force standing between her and death. As days stretched, survival became rhythm. His eyes never rested, scanning for threats, while his back bore her weight without complaint. She offered what she could, her knowledge of politics, of reading symbols on the ship's ruined tech, of identifying certain medicines packed for her comfort that now meant survival. Together, they became something new, bound not by station, but by necessity. But safety remained fragile. Rumors in the wreckage, signs of tracks too uniform, too deliberate, warned that this was more than an accident. Other survivors had spoken before vanishing, whispering of mercenaries sent to ensure the princess did not live. Every step away from the crash site brought new dangers, and each night the sense of pursuit grew heavier. The wilderness had not broken them, but it had only been the first trial. Now, hunted and outnumbered, the janitor's endurance and the princess's awakening resolve would be tested against enemies far more ruthless than hunger or beasts. The struggle for survival had just begun, and the noble's cowardice was nothing compared to what stalked them now. The signs of pursuit could no longer be ignored. Footprints too disciplined, movements too coordinated, and the absence of animals where hunters passed confirmed what the janitor had already feared. The crash had been no accident. Mercenaries were sweeping the wilderness, killing without hesitation, leaving no survivors who could testify. Nobles who had fled first were found strung up as warnings, their wealth stripped, their pleas silenced by blades. Cowardice had bought them no mercy, only a quicker end. The princess, once sheltered from blood and violence, watched with widening eyes as truth settled in. Her survival was not simply chance, it was defiance of an execution ordered by those who should have defended her. Rage tempered her weakness, and she began to see her protector not as a servant, but as the only loyal hand fate had left her. Where nobles had abandoned, he had stayed. Where guards had faltered, he had endured. The janitor fought not with polished weapons, but with desperation turned to skill. Scrap metal became blades, wire became snares, and every piece of wreckage served as part of his defense. Mercenaries trained for war found themselves outwitted by a man who had spent his life solving problems no one else would touch. He bled in silence, bore wounds without complaint, and pressed forward with relentless determination. For him, survival was not glory. It was duty to a woman who had been cast aside by her own blood. The first clash left the princess shaken. She saw him stand against armored killers with nothing but sharpened steel from the wreck, saw him set traps that turned terrain into allies, saw him stagger, yet rise again each time a blow nearly broke him. His strength was not the refined training of noble soldiers, but the raw resilience of someone who had labored every day unseen. Watching him, the truth carved itself deep. Nobility had nothing to do with blood, and everything to do with sacrifice. Her transformation was quiet but irreversible. No longer did she speak of orders or commands. She began instead to whisper strategies, share what fragments of knowledge she carried, and place her trust in his judgment. Her arrogance cracked under the weight of his endurance. The man who had once scrubbed floors now stood as her shield, and she clung not to his status, but to his humanity. The mercenaries pressed closer, numbers overwhelming, tactics ruthless. Each fight carved more scars into the janitor, yet he pushed forward, dragging her through shadows, carrying her when her strength gave out. His body bent under the strain, but his will never faltered. What had begun as the duty of a forgotten man had grown into something larger, a vow forged in fire and blood, that he would see her live, no matter the cost to himself. The wilderness no longer felt like their greatest enemy. Hunger and predators had been trials, but this was something darker. The deliberate erasure of a life, the attempted silencing of a voice that still mattered. The janitor knew the odds were against them, but every mercenary defeated was proof that human grit could break even the strongest chains. The princess knew it too, and in her heart, the meaning of nobility was rewritten. The trial was not over, but already the balance had shifted. The nobles who had abandoned her were gone, their names destined to rot in shame. The janitor, wounded and unyielding, was all that stood between her and oblivion, and in his shadow, she discovered a truth she could never again deny, that greatness is not inherited, it is earned in the fire of survival. The chase ended at the edge of despair, the janitor staggering beneath wounds that would have felled stronger men. Each step was agony, yet he carried the princess as though nothing else mattered. Behind them, mercenaries closed in, relentless in their pursuit. Before them, the faint pulse of a distress beacon flickered through the haze, the last fragile hope of rescue. The janitor pressed forward, his body broken but his resolve untouched, every heartbeat driven by the silent promise he had made in the wreckage. The mercenaries struck with the confidence of hunters sure of their prey. The janitor met them with nothing left but stubborn endurance, turning wreckage into weapons one final time. He fought with hands that bled, with a back bent beneath weight, with eyes burning with the will to deny them victory. The princess, once resigned to fragility, watched him stand where no noble had, watched him give every shred of strength for her survival. The sight seared itself into her soul, shattering the last fragments of her old world. Rescue came not with trumpets, but with the roar of search vessels breaking through the storm. Mercenaries scattered under the sudden blaze of engines and gunfire. Soldiers descended, expecting to find nobles in command, yet instead their eyes fell on a bloodied janitor clutching the crippled air. Shock rippled through them as the truth unfolded. Those sworn to loyalty had fled, while the lowest among them had carried their princess through fire and death. The nobles who survived slunk forward, eager to rewrite the tale, but the princess spoke before they could twist it. Her voice, once frail and uncertain, rang with clarity as she named her rescuer, not a servant, but as the only one worthy of honor. She denounced those who had abandoned her, stripping their titles in front of all, exposing cowardice where they had once claimed dignity. The janitor, humbled and scarred, tried to step back into the shadows, but she would not allow it. What had begun as a duty born of instinct had become the foundation of something greater. In her eyes, he was the standard by which all others would now be measured. His survival, his strength, his unyielding loyalty redefined the meaning of nobility. No crown, no title, no ancient bloodline could stand taller than the man who had carried her from the wreckage and through the wilderness when the world itself seemed bent on her death. As they were lifted from the ruined world, the divide between servant and sovereign dissolved. He had not saved her for power or recognition, but because it was right, because humanity at its core was endurance and compassion, even when unacknowledged. The princess, once crippled in both body and spirit, was remade by the fire of survival, her voice sharpened by truth. Together they emerged not as noble and janitor, but as two souls bound by the ordeal, proof that courage could be found in the unlikeliest of places. In the wreckage of shattered titles and broken vows, the nobles had revealed their emptiness. The janitor had revealed something greater. Humanity had spoken through him, not with words, but with action. That true worth is not born but forged, and that in the darkest hour, it is not crowns that save kingdoms, but the strength of those the world least expects.